The Galactic Coalition had catalogued thousands of worlds, each reduced to data points, threat curves, and extinction probabilities. Civilizations rose, expanded, and collapsed with predictable symmetry. The universe, to the Coalition, was a solved equation. When Earth entered their charts, it did not inspire fear. It inspired academic interest. Humans were classified quickly: bipedal mammals, forward-facing eyes, omnivorous diet, moderate intelligence, extreme persistence. A predator species, yes, but not an exceptional one. Countless predators had been erased before. Coalition analysts noted humanity's tendency toward conflict and assumed self-destruction would soften resistance. Fragmented governance, ideological fractures, and internal rivalries suggested a species unable to unite under pressure. Their wars were frequent, brutal, and inefficient. From orbit, Earth looked noisy, chaotic, and strategically immature. The conclusion was unanimous. Humans would fight. Humans would lose. The invasion plan reflected that certainty. Precision strikes would cripple satellites and grids. Displays of orbital dominance would shatter morale. Leadership nodes would be removed, leaving populations directionless. The goal was not annihilation but submission. Earth's biosphere was valuable. Its inhabitants were not. The Coalition had perfected this approach across dozens of sectors. Compliance followed fear. Fear followed inevitability. Early biological assessments reinforced confidence. Humans lacked natural weapons. No claws, no fangs, no exoskeletons. Their skin was fragile. Their sensory range narrow. Their bodies were prone to injury and decay. Analysts compared them to prey species that had learned aggression as a survival crutch. Dangerous in groups, manageable in isolation. Technology, not instinct, made them threatening, and technology could be neutralized. What intrigued the Coalition most was endurance. Humans could pursue prey for hours, sometimes days, ignoring pain, hunger, and exhaustion. They adapted to extreme climates with unnatural ease. Deserts, tundra, oceans, jungles, none had stopped them. This trait earned cautious footnotes in the report, but no revisions to the threat level. Endurance without coordination was simply suffering extended. Cultural analysis was treated as secondary. Art, myth, and historical memory were compressed into behavioral summaries. Analysts acknowledged humanity's fixation on struggle narratives and heroic violence, but dismissed it as compensatory storytelling. Species that glorified war, the Coalition believed, usually lacked the capacity to win it. The louder the legends, the weaker the reality. One subsection, buried deep in the data, mentioned regional irregularities. Certain populations displayed abnormal familiarity with weapons, unusually decentralized command habits, and a historical preference for asymmetric warfare. Their cultural identity was tied not to stability, but to resistance. The notation was flagged, then deprioritized. Earth was Earth. Borders were arbitrary. Humans were humans. The Coalition failed to understand a simple truth. Predators are not defined by teeth or muscle, but by behavior under pressure. They did not ask how humans hunted when the odds were against them. They did not study how a species that fought itself so often could become efficient so quickly. They measured potential by averages and ignored extremes. As the Armada moved toward Earth, confidence remained absolute. Simulations predicted rapid collapse once the illusion of control was broken. No scenario accounted for curiosity in the face of terror, or defiance as a reflex. The Coalition believed fear would end the fight. They did not realize that for humans, fear was often the beginning. In countless prior conquests, resistance had followed logic. It bent when survival demanded it. Humanity, however, had evolved on a world where survival favored those who tested limits rather than accepted them. Every generation inherited stories of standing ground, of turning disadvantage into leverage, of refusing extinction out of stubborn identity alone. These stories were not fantasies. They were training. The Coalition mistook them for noise, never suspecting they were listening to a species rehearsing for exactly this moment, waiting for something vast enough to justify becoming what it always had been beneath the surface. They were about to learn that assumptions kill faster than weapons, and ignorance is the most reliable invitation to extinction imaginable in history. The first strikes came without ceremony. Light bent, space cracked, and objects the size of cities slid into orbit as if they had always owned the sky. Human satellites went dark in coordinated waves. Power grids failed. Communications fractured into isolated pockets. To the coalition, this was the opening act of compliance. To humans, it was confirmation. Cities burned, but not uniformly. Where infrastructure collapsed, people did not freeze. They scattered. Analog systems reappeared from museums and basements. Vehicles without digital controls roared back to life. Old radios hummed. Paper maps replaced screens. What looked like regression was adaptation. Humans did not cling to efficiency when it failed. They abandoned it without sentiment. The coalition deployed ground forces expecting chaos and panic. Instead, they encountered silence, then violence. Supply convoys vanished between landing zones. Patrols were drawn into streets that became kill corridors. Civilians did not behave like civilians. They moved with intent, vanished into structures, and reappeared behind lines. Resistance cells formed without orders, without hierarchy, without visible coordination, yet somehow acted in rhythm. Captured humans revealed nothing useful. Pain responses existed, but fear did not escalate as predicted. Many treated interrogation as a delay tactic, asking questions of their own. Some laughed. Others stared with an intensity that unsettled even veteran enforcers. Coalition psychologists flagged the anomaly, noting that humans framed captivity not as defeat, but as temporary inconvenience. Every loss taught them something. They watched weapon patterns, studied armor seams, tested response times. Failed attacks were not repeated. Successful ones spread rapidly through improvised networks. Tactics evolved within hours. What the coalition saw as desperation was actually analysis under fire. Humans did not rush to win. They rushed to learn. Attempts at decapitation failed to produce collapse. When leadership nodes vanished, replacements emerged immediately, often without formal authority. Decisions were made locally, executed immediately, and discarded when ineffective. The coalition had never faced a species comfortable operating without a center. Control strategies unraveled against something that did not depend on control. Fear propagation models broke down. Displays of overwhelming force did not suppress resistance. They intensified it. Each strike hardened resolve, transformed survivors into participants. Loss did not signal futility. It signaled obligation. Humans responded to devastation not with submission, but with focus. Their emotional response was not despair, but direction. The coalition began revising projections. Casualty ratios shifted. Engagement durations lengthened. Ammunition expenditures exceeded forecasts. Humans were not matching technology with technology. They were matching intention with creativity. Traps appeared where none should exist. Alien sensors were deceived by heat, noise, and deliberate clutter. Humans weaponized unpredictability itself. A new conclusion formed within coalition command. Humans were predators unquestionably, but still limited. Their aggression was reactive, their coordination inconsistent, their victories local. Given time, attrition would break them. The invasion pressed forward under that assumption, confident that pressure would eventually crush resistance. What they failed to see was the pattern beneath the chaos. Humans were not fighting the invasion. They were studying it. Each skirmish fed a growing understanding of alien doctrine. Each loss sharpened their methods. They were not improvising blindly. They were iterating. Across the planet, the same behaviors emerged independently. Withdraw, observe, adapt, strike. The method repeated with unsettling consistency. It was not taught. It was instinct refined by history. Humanity had spent millennia competing with itself, perfecting the art of conflict against equals. Now faced with something greater, those instincts aligned. The coalition believed it was witnessing the last convulsions of a cornered species. In truth, it was watching predators settle into the hunt, shedding panic, discarding hesitation, and calibrating their movements. Humanity was not breaking. It was waking up, and the universe was about to discover that this was only the baseline. Coalition surveillance flagged the anomaly late. Data streams from one region refused to stabilize. Engagement maps from North America showed no clear front lines, no predictable retreats, no civilian collapse curves. Resistance density increased instead of thinning. Losses mounted where pressure was highest. Analysts initially blamed terrain. Then they blamed coincidence. Both explanations failed. In this region, civilians did not wait for instructions. They did not wait for permission. They did not wait at all. Homes became supply nodes. Stores became armories. Roads became traps. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant dissolved completely, not through chaos, but through participation. Everyone contributed something useful. Coalition forces reported encountering humans who behaved less like defenders and more like hunters. Patrols were tracked, not avoided. Movement patterns were studied over days, sometimes weeks, before a single strike was launched. When attacks came, they were decisive and vanishing. No celebration followed. No pursuit. Only silence, then repositioning. Intercepted communications confused translation systems. Humor appeared frequently, often during active engagements. Casual language accompanied lethal intent. Jokes were exchanged while casualties were treated. This was not hysteria. It was emotional regulation. Americans did not suppress fear. They drowned it in familiarity, turning terror into routine. The volume of privately owned weapons shocked coalition tacticians. Firearms were everywhere, but that was not the danger. The danger was proficiency. Many Americans had grown up handling weapons casually, recreationally, culturally. Marksmanship was not rare. Maintenance was not specialized knowledge. Ammunition production restarted in garages and workshops within days. Veterans emerged as force multipliers. Not as commanders, but as catalysts. Experience spread informally, absorbed rapidly. No rigid doctrine was imposed. Techniques were shared, modified, discarded. The coalition expected discipline through hierarchy. Instead, it faced discipline through competence, enforced socially rather than structurally. Captured recordings revealed a mindset that unsettled coalition observers. Americans spoke of the invasion as a problem to be solved, not a catastrophe to be endured. They discussed weaknesses openly. They critiqued failures without shame. Losses were acknowledged, then folded into planning. Emotion existed, but it did not dominate decision-making. Coalition countermeasures intensified. Heavier units were deployed. Surveillance saturation increased. It did not help. Americans learned censor blind spots quickly. They exploited bureaucratic delay. They anticipated responses before they occurred. It became common for coalition forces to arrive at ambush sites already abandoned, traps triggered without targets. One report described a coalition officer realizing he was being hunted only after reviewing post-engagement footage. The humans had circled his unit for hours, mapping reactions, probing defenses, disengaging repeatedly. The final strike was brief and overwhelming. The objective was not annihilation. It was information extraction. Psychological profiles were updated in haste. Americans were no longer treated as a subset of humanity. They were reclassified separately. Not stronger. Not smarter. More accustomed to uncertainty. More comfortable with risk. Conditioned by history to view conflict as inevitable rather than exceptional. What frightened the coalition most was enjoyment. Not cruelty, but satisfaction. Americans derived meaning from resistance itself. Fighting was not merely survival. It was identity reaffirmed. They believed themselves capable of overcoming anything if they refused to quit. This belief was not theoretical. It was practiced constantly. The coalition finally understood its mistake. Humans were predators by nature, but Americans had refined predation into culture. They hunted systems, not bodies. They broke processes, not just units. What the coalition faced was not rebellion. It was an adversary that expected to win eventually and behaved accordingly, patiently, relentlessly, without doubt, without pause. The shift was not announced. There was no moment the coalition could point to and label as the turning point. One cycle, humans were resisting. The next, Americans were shaping the war. Coalition Command noticed it first in logistics reports. Equipment losses no longer aligned with engagements. Weapons disappeared without battles. Systems failed without attacks. Something was moving beneath the surface. Captured technology began reappearing in altered form. Power cells were stripped and repurposed. Armor alloys were cut, layered, and welded into crude but effective protection. Targeting components were bypassed entirely, replaced with human optics and intuition. What should have taken research facilities took days. What should have required experts took communities. Americans did not wait to understand alien science. They learned just enough to make it dangerous. Coalition doctrines unraveled. Reinforcements arrived late to fights that had already ended. Heavy units were baited into urban zones where size became a liability. Air superiority meant nothing when landing zones turned into precision traps. Americans did not seek fair engagements. They sought favorable ones, and when those did not exist, they created them. Psychological warfare escalated. False signals flooded coalition channels. Retreat patterns were mimicked to lure pursuit. Silence itself became a weapon. Units advanced cautiously, exhausted by anticipation, unsure which movement was real. Fear crept into decision-making, slowing responses, creating hesitation. Americans exploited that hesitation mercilessly. The most disturbing development was predictability, not in American behavior, but in coalition reactions. Once patterns were identified, Americans began acting ahead of responses, not against them. Ambushes were set where reinforcements would go, not where enemies were. Supply lines were severed before shortages were felt. Americans were no longer reacting. They were directing flow. Coalition analysts struggled to explain it. Americans were not unified under a single command. There was no central intelligence hub. Yet information moved faster than coalition updates. The explanation was uncomfortable but accurate. Americans trusted initiative. They rewarded problem solving. Failure was instructional, not shameful. This created a feedback loop of relentless improvement. Historical context finally received attention. Analysts dug into centuries of conflict, frontier survival, internal division, external pressure. A pattern emerged. American culture was forged in instability. Security was never assumed. Resistance was normalized. Conflict was framed as an obstacle, not a tragedy. This did not make them cruel. It made them prepared. Coalition morale degraded. Soldiers accustomed to overwhelming dominance now faced an enemy that refused to be intimidated. Losses carried psychological weight. Americans did not overextend victories. They withdrew deliberately, leaving questions instead of bodies. Every encounter felt unfinished. Every quiet moment felt dangerous. One coalition commander described the sensation succinctly before being relieved of duty. He said it felt like fighting something that had already survived this war in its imagination. Americans behaved as if outcome was a matter of time, not chance. Their confidence was not loud. It was operational. As weeks passed, the invasion stalled. Not through a single decisive battle, but through erosion. Systems failed faster than they could be repaired. Units hesitated. Orders layered with caution. Initiative died within coalition ranks, strangled by uncertainty. Americans thrived in that uncertainty. They had lived there long before the invasion. By the time Coalition Command acknowledged the shift, it was irreversible. Humans were predators. Americans were something more refined. They did not just hunt enemies. They hunted advantage itself, stripping wars down to mechanics and mastering them. The coalition had entered the conflict expecting conquest. It found itself trapped in a contest of adaptation, facing a culture that treated adaptation as instinct, and it was losing ground without ever seeing the full shape of what was taking it. The withdrawal began quietly, disguised as repositioning. Coalition fleets shifted orbits, reduced ground deployments, and consolidated assets under the language of recalibration. No announcement was made. None was needed. Everyone involved understood what retreat looked like when pride refused to name it. What the coalition could not understand was that Americans noticed immediately. Pursuit did not follow. There was no reckless chase, no demand for vengeance. Instead, pressure continued in precise, measured ways. Supply disruptions intensified. Communication interference increased. Every attempt to stabilize positions met resistance before momentum formed. Americans were not interested in chasing fleeing enemies. They were interested in ensuring those enemies never returned with confidence. Human coordination accelerated once the threat reversed direction. Fragmented resistance networks linked effortlessly. Knowledge gained through blood and improvisation was shared globally. What had begun as survival transformed into doctrine. Earth stopped reacting as a collection of nations and started acting as a species that had passed the test it never asked for. The coalition convened emergency councils. Threat models collapsed. Engagement histories contradicted doctrine. The final assessment was brutal in its clarity. Humanity was no longer a manageable predator species. Earth was reclassified as a prohibited contact world. Any future engagement was deemed strategically irresponsible. The cost could not be predicted, controlled, or justified. Within that ruling, a separate annotation appeared. One region required explicit warning. American populations were identified as strategic apex predators. Not due to aggression, but due to behavior. They adapted faster than intelligence models could track. They embraced uncertainty rather than resisting it. They converted pressure into momentum. Conflict did not degrade them. It refined them. A final transmission was broadcast to all coalition forces before departure. It was not a threat. It was an admission. The message advised future civilizations to abandon assumptions when dealing with humans. It warned against mistaking humor for softness, decentralization for weakness, and freedom for disorder. It stated plainly that Americans fought wars the way others fought extinction, with creativity, patience, and refusal to concede inevitability. On Earth, there was no celebration. Ruins still smoked. Losses were counted. Names were remembered. Americans returned to rebuilding with the same intensity they had brought to resistance. The war did not become legend immediately. It became reference. A lesson stored, examined, and internalized. Preparation resumed, not out of fear, but out of habit. Across the galaxy, the story spread distorted by distance and awe. Some called humans monsters. Others called them guardians of a forbidden world. Most agreed on one truth. Earth was not to be tested again. The species that lived there did not seek dominance, but neither did it tolerate subjugation. Humanity hunted to survive. Americans hunted to finish things. They did not conquer the stars. They did something far more unsettling. They taught the universe restraint. The coalition had arrived believing power decided outcomes. It left understanding that mindset did. Predators could be outgunned. Cultures built on adaptation could not. The invasion failed not because humans were stronger, but because they were unwilling to accept limits imposed by others. Long after the last coalition vessel vanished, that realization lingered. Somewhere beyond mapped space, future strategists would study Earth and hesitate. Not because of its weapons, but because of what lived behind them. A species that learned. A culture that hunted advantage. A planet that responded to extinction-level threats not with surrender, but with clarity. The galaxy adjusted its behavior accordingly, because survival demanded it.